important to do that. I made it clear that I'm going to do whatever is best for the country. And I think part of it may go back, I would have to say, to my service in the Un-American Activities Committee, when it was a fact that apart from Alger Hiss, many of those who were investigated by the committee in government and out had Jewish backgrounds because of their liberal persuasion and so forth, and because of what happened in World War II. So under the circumstances, those of us who were on the committee, many of us unfairly, even though I have supported Israel on every vote and every speech ever since then, are designated as being anti-Semitic. Another thing, too, I have made it very clear that I didn't appreciate the fact that during the Vietnam War, at a time when I was asking the country for support of Vietnam, some of those who violently opposed what we did in Vietnam, demonstrated against us, were just as violently urging us to support Israel. And I made the point over and over again that if we failed in Vietnam in supporting one country and so forth, it would slop over. It would make it very difficult to enlist the support in case Israel came under attack. And I think that did not particularly go down with some Jewish voters. But that's part of the life.
Henry Kissinger has described some of the factors he felt that he had to take into account in dealing with you because of your attitudes towards Jews. He wrote, Nixon shared many of the prejudices of the uprooted California lower middle class from which he had come. He believed that Jews formed a powerful, cohesive group in American society, that they were predominantly liberal, that they put the interests of Israel above everything else, that on the whole they were more sympathetic to the Soviet Union than other ethnic groups, that their control of the media made them dangerous adversaries, above all that Israel had to be forced into a peace settlement and could not be permitted to jeopardize our Arab relations. Taking those elements, do you think that the Jews form a powerful, cohesive group in American society?
Powerful but not cohesive, because I had a lot of support among many very intelligent and I think perceptive Jews who saw that I was frankly the best friend that Israel had because of the very fact that I had the strength to do things that others would talk about.
Do you think the Jews are predominantly liberal?
Oh yes, for reasons that are very understandable. Growing out of the World War II experience and having in mind the fact that that to a certain extent is their credit. I mean, for example, the Jews generally have been very pro-civil rights. I understand that because they consider themselves to be a minority group. However, ironically though, the Jews are very much against the quota system because there they realize that if you have a quota for blacks, you may have one for Jews, and if you have one for Jews, there ought to be one United States senator, not 7.
Do you feel that Jews put the interests of Israel above everything else?
No, I've already covered that, I think very well.
Do you think on the whole that they are more sympathetic to the Soviet Union than other ethnic groups?
Way back, there was a period, during the war period, when the Soviet Union was carrying the brunt of the fighting against Hitler, when a great number of American Jews were far more sympathetic to the Soviet Union than maybe some other Americans were. However, I would say that at the present time that is not the case.
Do you think that their control, that Jewish control of the media makes them dangerous adversaries?
Oh, it makes Jewish control of the media, first, it is not total. It is significant, particularly of television, at the managerial level and at the top level. But as far as adversaries are concerned, the answer is that if they are against you, then of course that's going to be a very difficult load to carry. I think Secretary Connolly found that out in his campaign for the presidential nomination. He seemed to have very good support in the media until he made a speech which was interpreted by many as being quite pro-Arab, his so-called Mideast speech. And from that time on, he felt at least, and I would tend to agree, that his media support turned very strongly the other way. Now, I don't think it's because they thought he was anti-Semitic. I don't believe that at all, but he just wasn't taking the line that they could.
Do you feel that you suffered because of, in the media, because of Jewish anti-Nixon feeling?
No, not because, no, that isn't true. That isn't the case. It isn't Jewish anti-Nixon feeling, it's media anti-Nixon feeling. I mean, basically, the media, apart from whether it's Jewish or not, the media generally is liberal, just as the university community is generally liberal and so forth. And basically, I'm not a liberal, I'm a conservative.
Do you feel that Israel has to be forced into peace settlements so as not to jeopardize our Arab relations?
No, that's incorrect, of course. I think that Israel, the very fact that in 1973 in San Clemente, when Brezhnev for 3 hours tried to get me to agree to join him in imposing a settlement on Israel, which would force them to give up all the occupied lands without any guarantees in return, and I resisted that, is a pretty good answer to that.
Do you think that Israel has the bomb, the atomic bomb?
I don't know, but most experts believe they do. And I would say it's really irrelevant as to whether I think so or the experts think so.
Does it worry you if they do?
There's no question about this score. They have the capability, if they don't have it, of getting it very, very fast because they're a very highly developed industrial society.
If the Mideast goes nuclear, can Armageddon be forestalled for very long?
One of the reasons that developing some sort of progress in the whole Mideastern relationship, defusing the Palestinian issue and so forth, one of the reasons, too, in the broader sense of developing some kind of arms control agreements between the major powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, and so forth, is that the greatest danger, perhaps, in the future of nuclear war is not going to come from the United States or the Soviet Union, both of whom, because of the great amount of nuclear power they have, fear its use and would be deterred to use it. The greatest danger is going to come from a nation that is smaller, that is desperate, and that just wouldn't care. And this lets the genie out of the bottle. It's proliferation of nuclear weapons that concerns me at the present time and should concern the Russians, should concern the Americans. And so as I look at it, looking at the Israelis, certainly I would think they would be more responsible than many others, but let us suppose the Libyans get it. Now they are a little crazy, I think. Certainly their leadership is. And that is why we've got to get this thing under control before it's proliferated out there, because the danger of a nuclear explosion then, and which would spread worldwide, is simply unacceptable.
Isn't it too late, though, to stop proliferation? There's so much material out there. Is it really practical? It's like the argument about calling in handguns, that there's just so many out there.
Very difficult. But unless I would say this, unless the two major countries find some way to control themselves, then there will be no inhibiting effect on other countries. No, I don't think you can say that because these weapons are so terrible, they're not going to be had by others. But on the other hand, if the United States and the Soviet Union can find some agreement between themselves, it will have some restraining effect.
In October of 1973, American forces were put on worldwide nuclear alert. How close did we come to nuclear war in October of 1973?
I don't think we came very close, actually. I think what happened is that the alert was in response to the Soviet Union putting its airborne divisions on alert, putting 85 ships into the Mediterranean, ships equipped with helicopters and landing barges and the rest, and Brezhnev indicating to me through a message that unless we would join him in sending American forces in, along with Russian forces, to help keep the peace in that area, that he would move in unilaterally. We had to respond with an alert in order to keep them out.
At the time when you...
we had it front, and when sometimes when people ask, well, when you called the alert, which incidentally was not just the nuclear forces, even just as important, all of our conventional forces in the Mediterranean, the fleet, which was quite powerful, they were also put on alert. And when the follow-up question there is often, well, suppose the Russians had moved in with divisions, airborne divisions and otherwise, into the Mideast. Would you have used the nuclear option? And my answer to that is that it isn't important what I might have done. The important thing is Brezhnev thought I might. And he thought I might because of the record, the track record I'd already established. And when people say, would you have done this or that, on the other thing, in a case like that, my answer goes back to my poker playing days. When you got a hole card, you never show it unless they call you.
In October of 1973, when you received word that war had broken out in the Middle East, you were up to your ears in domestic problems. Congress was debating the War Powers Act. The special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, that you'd appointed was causing a lot of trouble with his requests for White House files and tapes. You were waiting for the Court of Appeals ruling on whether you were going to have to surrender White House tapes. Vice President Agnew was about to have to resign, and you were going to have to choose a new vice president. How did you manage, with all those things going on, to keep abreast of the international crisis?
Well, it was not easy. As a matter of fact, in that period from October 6th to November 7th, October 6th was when the war started, and October 7th was when we renewed relations with Egypt and when Kissinger started on his shuttle again. In that period, there were three great crises converged, and it was the most tumultuous period of the American presidency for any 30-day period that I can certainly recall. I, of course, had all these political problems as a result of the Watergate business and so forth, so that I was really fighting with one hand rather than two. And so it was like a juggler trying to juggle three balls with just one hand. Just thinking back to the calendar of what happened then, one thing right after another. On October the 6th, we learned that the Syrians and the Egyptians had launched a surprise attack on Israel. I say surprise. It was no surprise to me that our intelligence didn't discover it because they're really not that good. But I was very surprised that the Israelis didn't, because they have the best intelligence in the world, and they were totally surprised. That was on the 6th. 3 days later, on the 9th, Vice President Agnew resigned after a long investigation. And then 3 days after that, we got word that the Egyptians and the Syrians were having great success on the battlefield, and that it was going to be necessary, at least it was requested by Golda Meir, that we resupply the Israelis for the tank losses and others that they had and airplane losses. Then the next day, on the 10th of October, we had these three issues coming up again. On the 10th of October, I nominated President or Vice President Ford. He was then, of course, Vice President in the Congress. I nominated him for Vice President to succeed Agnew. The Watergate thing came to attention that day because that was the day that the Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against us in the tapes case by 5-2. And on that day, too, I had to bring the Defense Department in line and have them go forward on a massive airlift to Israel, which was the biggest airlift, incidentally, since the Berlin airlift, and turned out to be much bigger in terms of tonnage that was delivered. That would seem enough, however, but it wasn't the end. We went on through the month. On the 18th of that month, I finally worked out what I thought would be a successful compromise insofar as the tapes are concerned, one that would be in substantial compliance with the decision of the court, when I got Senator Stennis to agree to review all the tapes that they had been requested, and then to furnish to the Senate Watergate Committee and to the Special Prosecutor, Archibald Cox, summaries of anything that was relevant to their investigations. The following day, I was very encouraged on the 19th when Senator Irvin of the Irvin Committee and Senator Baker, who was the Republican member of that committee and leader, came in and they agreed to it. They were enthusiastic about the program. And I thought we were out of the woods on that issue. But unfortunately, that was not the case. The following day, the 20th, was all three balls in the air, it seems, at one time. Early in the morning, we received notice from Brezhnev that he wanted Kissinger to come to Moscow because prior to that time, on the 18th, he had requested for the first time that we join him in sending American combat forces in with Russian combat forces into the Mideast in order to keep the peace. And we weren't going to be suckered on that one. But Kissinger was to go over to Moscow to see if he could work out a ceasefire. So I sent Kissinger off in the morning of that day. Later in the morning, Archibald Cox had a press conference, and he refused to accept the Stennis Compromise and demanded that he have access to more tapes on a fishing expedition. I thought that this was in violation, frankly, of his charter, so I directed the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire him. Elliot Richardson refused to do so, although we had assumed from the conversations he had had earlier, because he had been told about the compromise earlier, that he would do so and if Cox was unreasonable. Later that day, Elliot Richardson came in to see me to submit his resignation. Now, I had known him for many years. He had been in the cabinet, and he'd been in various high positions and so forth throughout, which is fine, and did a very fine job in them. But in this particular case, I urged him not to stay on, but simply to delay his resignation. I pointed out that Kissinger was in the air going to Moscow. I pointed out that if he were to resign, that it would have a very detrimental effect insofar as the Russians are concerned. It would give them the idea that we were in disarray. And he refused, however, and he decided that he was going to have to resign. I've often wondered why he didn't stay on at least that long, and I think in fairness to him, it was the fact that he was a pretty good politician, and he wasn't about to go down with what he considered as a politician to be a sinking ship.
Do you feel, though, that he rejected an appeal based on the national interest?
Yes, he did.
At a time of war and peace?
Well, he rejected it, but each of us was probably approaching it from a different standpoint. But on the other hand, my concerns were borne out by what happened after he left, because needless to say, it caused a firestorm in the press. About 5 newspapers that previously had supported us asked for my resignation. There were 20 impeachment resolutions went in.
This was the Saturday Night Massacre.
It's a so-called Saturday Night Massacre. And Brezhnev is bound to have heard about that in the Soviet Union.
Why didn't you change your timetable, and instead of asking him to stay on until after the war was settled, why didn't you wait to fire Cox until after the war was settled?
We couldn't, because we thought the Stennis Compromise had been agreed to, everything was in place. It had to move then. We couldn't wait. So under the circumstances, we could have done a lot of things differently, but we didn't at the time. So after the 20th then, we then came to the 24th, and the worst happened, as unfortunately I had a sense it might in the event that there appeared to be too much disarray. I think Brezhnev was really testing us. He knew I was in deep trouble, and he sent a message. This was after Kissinger had been there, and we thought a ceasefire was in place, saying that in the event that I would not agree to sending in a joint force of Americans and Russians into the Mideast, that he was going to intervene unilaterally. Well, the message itself wouldn't have bothered me that much, but then I got the intelligence reports that there were 85 Soviet ships in the Mediterranean, that on those ships, among other things, were helicopters and landing barges, and that 3 Soviet airborne divisions, 50,000 men, had been placed on alert. Well, we could not allow the Soviet Union to intervene unilaterally there, because if they had, we would have been forced to intervene. I know that Senator Mansfield had told us earlier in the month, right after the war, he said, we don't want another Vietnam there. But another member of Congress, who was in the majority on the Democratic side, made it very clear to in contrast. He said, we want to be sure that Israel continues to have support. And I said, I will not let Israel go down the tube. And I knew that under the circumstances we could not stand by and let the Soviet Union move in. And that would risk a world war. So under the circumstances, therefore, I approved an alert of our forces, nuclear and conventional. A couple of days after that, Brezhnev backed down, and finally the ceasefire went into place. This is all by now the 26th of October, only 20 days after the Yom Kippur War began. November 1st, the tide had changed by that time. The ceasefire was in place. Golda Meir, shortly after that, flew into Washington, thanked me very generously for the support we had given. And November the 7th, after a time of elapsing of 6 years, Egypt and the United States normalized their relations, and Henry Kissinger started on his very successful shuttle trip. Summarizing it all, I think it's very important to note here two things. One, this is not a demonstration of détente failing but succeeding. Unless I'd had the personal relationship with Brezhnev, unless he knew from what I had said to him at Camp David that we would not stand by unless I had developed that kind of relation, and unless he was looking forward to another summit the next year, I do not think that we would have been successful in keeping them out. That helped. The second point is that we handled the whole situation in a way that saved Israel, but at the same time did not totally alienate the Egyptians, because the Israelis, by the time the ceasefire occurred, had all totally surrounded the Egyptian Third Army, which was on the other side of the Suez Canal. So they held back, and the Egyptians were appreciative of that. And so as a result, this was one of those wars which ended with peace without victory. And peace without victory is virtually the only kind of peace you can have that will survive in that kind of a situation. You can have too great a victory. If it is too great, what happens is you plant the seeds for another war.
Under this enormous pressure with all these things going on and all these balls in the air, how did you manage to keep your emotional and mental bearings or equilibrium?
Well, it's not easy, but you did.
How do you react to some of the commentators who say that you were so distracted and so distraught during this period because of Watergate that you only became involved at erratic points in this Mideast crisis, and that most of the policy was Henry Kissinger's or General Haig's?
Well, I think the same people would say that that Henry Kissinger was the one that started the China Initiative, and that my participation, for example, was very limited in terms of that and other things and so forth. That the same ones would say that as far as the December bombing, which brought the war to Vietnam to an end and brought back our POWs, that was simply a reaction of an erratic man and so forth. And in this instance, all I could say is the record speaks for itself. I know the critical point where I made the decision, and it's here where I think it was decisive in overruling the recommendations I received from the Pentagon and that Kissinger brought into me. This was after Golda Meir had begged us to send in some supplies. We had to do it by air because the Soviet Union was sending in massive supplies by air. And Kissinger came in and said that the Pentagon was recommending 3 C-5As. I said, how many do we have? He said, about 20. I said, why don't we send 20? He said, well, because they think that that politically that's going to be more than the traffic will bear. I said, we're going to get just as much heat for sending 20. 3 is for sending 20. I said, send everything that flies. I don't think that many people thought that was a very rational decision, but you never make a small play when the stakes are big. You make a big one. We played for all the stakes and we won. Now that was my major participation, I would say.
Do you think that if the Libyans got the bomb, that would draw America and the Soviet Union together?
I would put it another way. There will at some point be a major Soviet-American summit. Very high on that agenda clearly apart from Soviet-American arms control agreements, should be what can the Soviet Union and the United States do to cool the situation in other areas of the world, peripheral areas, because Libya is like the Balkans in World War I. And under the circumstances, to allow these people to have it, and then to have them draw the Soviet Union and the United States into war is something that is not in our interest or theirs. This has nothing to do about whether the Soviet wants peace or war. They want the world. But on the other hand, we have to recognize they do not want a nuclear war any more than we do. So under the circumstances, we should join together at least to prevent that kind of action which would draw us in.
That finishes our afternoon hour.
Well, we got through most of it there.
Got through a lot, yes. Matter of fact, the only major thing we didn't get to was the Salzburg and the Alexandria, but that's easy to fill in. We did get through through Assad and the MiGs.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can get the phlebitis thing, and it's not big.
We've already got for the European trip, for the Soviet trip.
Mm-hmm. All right.